it wasn't necessarily about finding my grandfather. It led me down a path of finding things out about other family members and reconnecting with other family members, because my grandfather's uncle was an activist and the second president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. So, and that's called the PAC, that's the abbreviation, the PAC. So the PAC was a political party that broke away from the African National Congress, which was Nelson Mandela's party. And initially, the ANC was what we would call an Africanist party that believed that, you know, as we are fighting for our democratic rights, we also have to abolish the system of white hegemony as exists now, and we have to build an African first society that will be foregrounded by communism or socialism, some form of it. And then at some point in the 50s, the ANC developed a multiracial sort of manifesto and philosophy, which was characterized by this thing called the Freedom Charter, which was, a set of how the democracy is going to look once we've achieved our revolution. And within that, the very really progressive far left people in the ANC at the time were like, we don't agree with that, because they opened it up. Before, just used to be African people, Black African people in that group, and then they opened up to white people and Indians and Asians to join. And then they broke away. So they were far more staunch left, militant Pan-Africanists. And they were actually the people who were the architects of what is now known as the Sharpeville Massacre, which was this protest action where people in South Africa, Black people, burned their passbooks. So passbooks were this passport that Black people had to carry in apartheid to go through different zones. So there was Black only areas, the townships, and what they would call like the Bantustans, which are like where people are ethnically originally from, like your home villages in South Africa and things like that. So to cross from a Bantustan or a township to a suburban area where white people were to go and do your domestic work or your maybe mining in the city in Johannesburg, you had to carry your passport. It was a form of identification that was only for non-white people, basically. So there was this protest action where the PAC instructed Black people to burn their passbooks. So yeah, he was one of the architects behind that. And then, that was a strong aspect of the revolutionary, action that happened in South Africa was the PAC.
Welcome to the show, Thero.
All right, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've been looking at your work this week, and one of my favorite things about your work, not only the images, of course, but you have a great way of writing and titling your work, and it's just so compelling. And I think you're a great addition to the show. So I'm really excited to have you here today.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have and digging into my work, my practice, and my background, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a great show today. But before we get started, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Cool. So, yeah, my name is Thero Makepe, and I'm an artist currently based in Gaborone, Botswana. And yeah, I was born in 1996, was raised in Botswana, and then did my Bachelor of Fine Arts, majoring in photography in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town. And the fine arts school there is called the Michaela School of Fine Arts. And I finished in 2019, the year before COVID. And then since then, I've been a practicing artist in Botswana since then. And I'm part of an arts collective called the Botswana Pavilion, which is trying to advance Botswana's presence in the international arts arena. Our name comes from the Venice Biennale, where Botswana has never had a national pavilion, unlike other African countries like Zimbabwe or South Africa, for example. So that's something we're trying to do, is increase the presence of Botswana artists at these events and triennales, biennales in the world and things like that. But also unpack what it means to be a Tswana person, that ethnic identity and the national identity as it exists in the country and the diaspora. And then I'm also a board member of the Artist Residency Center here in Gaborone. We host local and international residents here. I'm the head of the international residencies here for that. So yeah, those are the things that I do.
Very active. I love it. And I love, it's like, I love it when an artist practice kind of goes deeper and out into the community and starts to engage. I think that's amazing. And you went to Cape Town University. Do you know the professor? It's Vanessa Cowling. Was she out there when you were there?
Yeah, Vanessa taught me like small 2-week projects when I was in like my second and third year. So yeah, I know Vanessa very, very well.
I just interviewed her 3 weeks ago. It's a small world. And so, yeah, that's pretty wild. That's really, really interesting. So my first questions, a lot of times I'm really curious about, like you, I'm curious about like where this connection to image making comes from. And I'm kind of curious a little bit about how you found your way into making images, photography, or.
I mean, there's two events or aspects or people who led me to be an artist. The first is just, being a millennial kid who was born in the mid-90s and then grew up in the 2000s. I grew up with a lot of movies and DVDs and VHS tapes. And those were my first experiences of art, I would say. Visual art and culture was, watching a lot of anime, comic books, Japanese manga, and all those kinds of things. So as a kid, I firstly just enjoyed storytelling, storytelling as we know it in terms of beginning, middle, and end. And, oral history as well. A lot of what we get in Botswana is oral history. We don't have a lot of written books about our history or, fictional folk tales and things like that. So you just hear it. And I think that led to, me having a desire to tell stories visually. Is like there's all these rich stories that are from here, but you don't have any visual material to supplement that like you do in other cultures. Even just across the border, like in South Africa, there's a lot more rich visual history and culture there. So initially I wanted to be a painter when I was a kid. I think a lot of kids go through the cycle of wanting to do comic books. And then, my teachers were like, learn how to draw from life, learn how to draw people. And then that led to me being interested in fine art, even though there's not like a lot of, there's no museums, there's no contemporary art museum, there's no commercial art gallery currently in Botswana. And while I was growing up, there was one that lasted for what, like 2 years, but then it closed down. So, I knew that I had to leave the country to do that. And I went to UCT, the Makepe School of Fine Arts. And there I wanted to be a painter still. And the first year that I was doing it, I didn't like how it was being taught. It was very strict and methodical for me. I was kind of just struggling. And we did everything. You had the option. We were forced to do everything in the first couple of years. So you had to do painting, printmaking, sculpture, photography. And within the first 2 years, because you choose your major in your third year, my strongest things were new media, video installations and other kinds of digital art making and photography. So I kind of just chose photography just to, finish the degree and get through the course. So I personally don't have an experience like a lot of photographers I like, or photographers in general, will tell you their story of like, my mom or my parents bought me a Kodak when I was like 8 years old, and I fell in love with photography from that moment. Or I had this strong desire to photograph my community and tell our story. My relationship with photography is very functional. Because even
Sure.
before 2016, 17, when I started picking up photography at the art school, my mom had bought me like a digital camera in like 2010, and then my first Canon DSLR around 2013 when I was 16 years old. And at that time, I was interested in graphic design, just as like a hobby. So I wanted to be able to take my own photos to do graphic design. And I was also shooting music videos for my friends who were musicians or rappers. So it was functional back then. I didn't have like an innate desire to go and, photograph a community and things like that. So that's the one aspect of like my journey of visual art making. On the other side of things, there's sort of like this paradox relationship that I have with my grandfather. So my grandfather was born in South Africa, and then he left in 1958 to come to Botswana as South Africa was transitioning from just being a white settler occupied colonial state to a more formalized system of apartheid that was run by the National Party. And that was a strict set of laws that kept black people and, well, non-white people in general, so not just black people but Indians and mixed race people, colored people, as they ethnically known in South Africa, separate and apart. It was segregation laws. So Botswana was a far less oppressive state at the time in 1958, and it became independent in 1966. And my grandfather moved here to escape, apartheid, and he remained there. He remained here ever since then. And he passed away in 2012. But when I was like a child, we had a very strong bond over art and music. But the irony with that is he fell blind in the late 80s. So he never physically saw me, ever. But he, I would say, raised me and my siblings, my cousins, my parents and uncles even to be artists, because he was a musician himself, performing in the 60s and 70s in Botswana with other musicians that had come across the border. So he'd always wanted one of his offspring to be more of a professional musician than he was, because he was more of a hobbyist, performing, at different events and things like that. But he never got to record an album because they didn't have recording facilities in Botswana in the 60s and 70s. So, that was like a dying wish of his. So I've always kept that at the back of my mind as a child, as an adult as well. Becoming an artist is like this irony of like I became a photographer, so to speak, and doing visual art, but my grandfather couldn't see that and he wanted me to do music. And so that's my background of how I came to be an artist.
Do you play any music? Do you play an instrument or anything?
Not exactly. So when I started my last year at Michaelis, I did a body of work called Music from My Good Eye, which explored that relationship between me and my grandfather in music. And then as it developed, it also touched on the activism in my maternal family as well. But I did a series of performative artworks called Monna wa Mino, which means man of music, translated from Setswana. That's my mother tongue. And I would be wearing the sort of suits and, attire that my grandfather would wear during his performances. So, these black suits and ties, borrowing from the African-American jazz tradition, your
Sure.
Miles Davis, Louis Armstrongs of the world and things like that. So I was doing that as still images. And then at the end, I learned how to play the trombone. And my grandfather's trombone specifically that he had left behind as a family heirloom. So I did like a 6-week crash course on how to play this trombone, which was interesting because it's obviously very old. So it was like, physically it's hard to play. It's not a new instrument. It's got its issues there. It needs to be, it wasn't tuned or anything like that and whatnot. things were coming loose a little bit and whatnot. And then it's like, I don't know how to play this thing really. Like I was just trying to play one specific song that was like one of his favorite compositions. So yeah, I learned how to play the trombone over 6 weeks, and I haven't picked it up since then. Aside from that, I'm a hobbyist DJ.
Right on.
DJing is also, yeah, I DJ, and I recently started learning how to produce music on a digital audio workstation. So like using Ableton to like make hip hop beats and sampling and stuff like that. So
I've always
not exactly playing an instrument, but playing an instrument.
Yeah, well, you kind of are. It's just you don't have the skill, of course, but you have the skill of composition. You're more a composer, I think. Which
Exactly.
is which I have always wanted to do that. I don't know. I just feel called to do that, and I can imagine an old trombone. That's the slide, right? It's if they don't get worked all the time, they get stuck. Yeah, I can imagine you trying to work that out. That's interesting. That's really, really interesting. Do you, when you did that project, did you feel, was it, do you think in an effort to kind of, is he still with you? Is he still alive, or is he still with you?
No, he passed away in 2012.
Okay.
When I was 15 years old. Yeah.
Okay. Did you say that? And I might have missed it.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did mention.
Yeah, I might have missed it. I don't want to. I was like, I thought I heard that, but I wasn't sure, and so I had to ask. But do you think, in some ways, doing that project, you were kind of trying to find him again? A lot of times when you lose somebody, you just kind of, especially somebody you're close with. Do you think that body of work was kind of a way of kind of connecting to that thing that he might have passed to you?
For me, it was more about celebrating the fact that I had someone in my life who allowed me to become an artist. Because when I just finished my third year and going into my final year, I was looking at myself in that I was finishing this degree in fine art at the University of Cape Town, and I was going to be one of 3 African Black people in this degree, finishing this thing out of like maybe 30 to 40 people. So the rest of them are like, white or Asian and things like that. So it's like this weird thing of like, only 3 Black people in an African institution, African country finishing this degree. But then also, so I mean, that's Cape Town, but then also where I'm from in Botswana, I'd grown up with a lot of friends who love art, appreciate art, but never went as far as I did in terms of going to university for it. And there's a myriad of factors in that. Parents don't look at it as something that's a safe career choice in terms of.
No, they don't.
There's no evidence. Yeah, definitely. But I'd say, man, like even more so, like here, just because we don't have a lot of examples of successful Botswana artists, artists from Botswana. So that's one aspect of things. And, people themselves also have that fear that like, how am I going to make money? How am I going to succeed? And all these kinds of things. So I looked at my grandfather and I looked at myself, like, how did I end up here? You just have these existential moments of like, I'm really
for sure.
Like, just like, look at your body from an outside perspective. And you're like, I'm really going to finish this thing. I'm finishing a degree. I'm becoming a professional artist, so to speak. So I looked at where that came from for me, like what's different about me that allowed that to happen. And it's my grandfather. My grandfather was, the statesman in the family in Botswana that facilitated that to allow me to be this person. So I wanted to make something that would celebrate that somebody allowed me to express myself in this kind of way. But I mean, in terms of finding it wasn't necessarily about finding my grandfather. It led me down a path of finding things out about other family members and reconnecting with other family members, because my grandfather's uncle was an activist and the second president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. So and that's called the PAC. That's the abbreviation, the PAC. So the PAC was a political party that broke away from the African National Congress, which was Nelson Mandela's party. And initially, the ANC was what we would call an Africanist party that believed that, as we are fighting for our democratic rights, we also have to abolish the system of white hegemony as exists now. And we have to build an African first society that will be foregrounded by communism or socialism, some form of it. And then at some point in the 50s, the ANC developed a multiracial manifesto and philosophy, which was characterized by this thing called the Freedom Charter, which was, a set of how the democracy is going to look once we've achieved our revolution. And within that, the very really progressive far left people in the ANC at the time were like, we don't agree with that, because they opened it up. Before, there used to be African people, Black African people in that group, and then they opened up to white people and Indians and Asians to join, and then they broke away. So they were far more staunch left, militant Pan-Africanists, and they were actually the people who were the architects of what is now known as the Sharpeville Massacre, which was this protest action where people in South Africa, Black people, burned their passbooks. So passbooks were this passport that Black people had to carry in apartheid to go through different zones. So there was Black-only areas, the townships, and what they would call like the Bantustans, which are like, where people are ethnically originally from, like your home villages in South Africa and things like that. So to cross from a Bantustan or a township to a suburban area where white people were to go and do your domestic work or your maybe mining in the city in Johannesburg, you had to carry your passport. It was a form of identification that was only for non-white people, basically. So there was this protest action where the PAC instructed Black people to burn their passbooks. So yeah, he was one of the architects behind that. And then, that was a strong aspect of the revolutionary, action that happened in South Africa was the PAC. So, I've known about that history since I was a child, after I'd Googled my mother's surname. But I'd never done a deep dive into it, because when I asked my mom and my grandfather at the time while he was still alive, they didn't tell it to me with a particular sense of urgency that this is something you have to know and you have to research and deeply understand. And, the philosophy of Pan-Africanism, the ideology behind it, and the Marxist values that they held themselves, and the principles and the different key people in the party and people around them. So, I kind of just like continued with like a sort of blissful ignorance that I went through. And then in my final year, as I'm like looking at my family tree and where my grandfather came from and things like that, and I'm just diving deep into the history, because initially it was just going to be about me and my grandfather. And then my lecturers are like, no, you have to like definitely go and do more about this, about the side of your family that was involved in activism and radical action as well. So, I started reconnecting with that side of the family, because the family that my grandfather left behind in South Africa, so his uncle who was an activist, and his children and the people around them, my grandfather kept those connections while he was still alive. And my memory of it is going to South Africa every year for weddings or funerals, just a family visit, just to go and see people. And my grandfather was a very charismatic, social, bubbly guy. But then when he passed away in 2012, we lost some of those connections, just because, my grandmother's a lot more quiet and, shy kind of woman. And my mom's the oldest of the three, and, people just sort of grow apart. So it took me on a journey of learning about that side of the family as an adult, because when I did meet with them again and go to their homes, because there was a side of it where I didn't want to tell their story because I felt that I just knew that they'd been through so much trauma in their lives that we didn't experience in Botswana, in a far less, or let me say, a far more peaceful country, with no civil war or uprising in its entire history. So I was very cautious about telling other people's story, even though I'm in that family. I'm related to them. But it wasn't until I met with them and they were open with me and sharing their experiences with me as an adult, of what it was like to be the son of an activist, someone who was heavily involved in radical action, him being in and out of jail, and that experience from the perspective of being a son, a daughter. Yeah, that was how I started learning about other people. Yeah.
That goes deep, and it's like this. It's amazing what life events can actually like. It kind of pushes us into this level of discovery, and you keep pushing. You think you keep going further down the tunnel, and it just keeps going and going and going. And what's interesting is that you were able to make in that process, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And it's really quite interesting. And so this kind of leads me to my next question. We're going to look at that project a little later. So I'm really interested in kind of getting a deeper look now, kind of having a lot more of the story. But I'm always curious about this moment that switches, and you own this idea of being an artist. You own it. And a lot of people, even when they go to art school and graduate with an art degree, they never own the idea of being an artist. And it seems like something switched for you, and you go, this is what I'm going to do. And this is the direction I'm going to go. What was that moment, and how did you know?
For me, it was very, very early as a child, I mean, as a kid growing up, I was a very shy child, and I spent a lot of time with my mom at home. And my mom, so I mean, the way I even think about making art right now goes back to being a child and putting together puzzles, piecing puzzles. And I like building things as a kid. Like, I used to like really, really like making card stacks, like with cards that you use to play poker and building things. So that was like, besides just consuming like visual media and culture, like, movies and anime and all these, comic books and things like that, I also like building things and putting things together. Like, this is how you make a puzzle. This is how you put together this picture, right? And that's always stayed with me, just as a pure enjoyment. I make art because I enjoy communicating things and seeing how I can make something complex, like all these pieces of this puzzle. How do I create that picture for you that you're going to consume as somebody else and enjoy the same way I enjoyed making it? So there's a certain level of enjoyment. And again, like, I was always just encouraged to do this thing. Like, every step of my journey, I was just determined. So I've wanted to be an artist for as long as I've been aware of that can be a career or a job, or it's something you can do. Like, as soon as I started like drawing, like I was like, I just went through different cycles of it, from wanting to do comic books and then to Japanese manga and then painting to now photography. Yeah.
Interesting. It's that's kind of the origin, and I kind of remember hearing that, and so it's like, and so you've taken it like, this is my life path, even from back then. Like, even back then, I used to do similar things like that. But even when I was in art school, I was still, I had the world telling me, that this wasn't practical. It's not a safe job, blah, blah, blah. But you finally have that moment where you go, you know what? Forget this bit. Forget that. This is the way I'm going. it's kind of when I decided to be a video production person and a photographer. I made that switch, but I was always like creative, but like I was always had these conflicts, between, like going and getting a safe job and a business somewhere, and versus being an artist and maybe even starting your own business doing it. And so I'm quite curious about that shift. Did that happen in university? Did you always? And I'm so curious that you always stayed on this path. This was it. You never looked sideways. No one talked you off of it. No one. And if that's true, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went to private schools in Botswana my whole life, so I was in schools that had art programs from when I was a kid to, being a teenager in high school. So art was always something that was holistically a part of the development of a person, of a human.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, my dad, maybe without saying it, sometimes I could sense it as a kid, probably might have liked for me to be a lawyer because I was really good at history and literature, obviously, in English language. I was really strong in those, humanities subjects. Again, going back to like my love for storytelling, I read a lot and I love literature and history. I love history as well. So those were always strong subjects. So like, I think my dad at the time, like in high school, towards the end of high school, probably would have maybe liked for me at the time to be a lawyer. But I was never really like heavily talked out of it. I think everybody just knew me as that kid that like is like very strong and determined about this is his thing. Everybody amazing. Has those, career guidance counselors in high school, right? And
yeah,
make you do a personality test of like, okay, like you got these skills, you're good at these subjects, and like maybe you work good in a team, so maybe you should do marketing, do engineering, or things like that. And I was like, nah, I don't need a personality test to tell me I want to be an artist. Like I was just always very firmly within that. But I will say, university was difficult though. University was difficult in terms of learning, because I had a sort of like blissful ignorance being in Botswana where I didn't have an experience of the art industry, the art world, in terms of galleries and museums and the way that it functions in terms of representation, being represented by a gallery and, commissions fees and consignments agreements and all these kinds of things. So once I got into the art academy, art institution, and started learning about the history of art and how the art industry functions, just like shadowing older artists, more experienced artists, and seeing how they live. It became quite like, do I really want to exist as an artist in this space? That became a question for me. Definitely. Like, how am I gonna work in this space? Because it's very difficult. It's very challenging. I would say, though, I feel I'm very fortunate. I think it's a great time to be an African artist in that they would say for like the past 15 years now, there's been an African art boom where a lot of Western collectors are buying a lot more African art right now, and people are a lot more interested in African stories. And that's just not just the art industry, the contemporary art industry, but even just in music and television and movies, a lot more African stories are being told. But I approach things definitely, even now, with a certain level of caution, of understanding every contract that I get and really reading it, and even verbal agreements, taking my time to say, okay, let me think about it before I fully commit to anything.
Yeah.
Because it can be, a lot of artists don't get, even in the academy, you don't get a lot of business training on how to be an artist as a basically an entrepreneur. You run a business, you run a studio,
exactly what
practice.
Yeah.
So I've always taken my time, and I'm very fortunate as well. I'm quite privileged at home that like my family um goes through this journey with me. You know, my mom helps me a lot with like balancing my books and my accounts and reading my contracts and even just decisions. You know, should we go with this one or that one, or work with this person or that or not? You know, all these kinds of things. So yeah, that was the most, that I would say, university and understanding the breadth and the scope of the art world and the industry, especially in the first 3 years. I think towards the end, I had a firm sense of, you know, this is what I want to get out of this industry as a working person, as a job, because a lot of people don't look at art as a job, but it's a real job. I'm a functioning part of the society as well. I'm contributing.
Well, and that's when you started to talk about who you were and you started to give kind of the organizations that you were a part of and what you kind of lead, that is how you do it. Not only are you making your own work, but you're also engaging the community at a whole. And there's a holistic approach to being an artist that I think a lot of people think they're going to live off the images that they make, but that's only one part of what it is that you do. You know what I mean? You might have a project that's in production for 6 years before you actually make any money on it. But what are you doing on the outside of that? I was just curious about that because, you know, you had that vision and you stayed on it. And I meet so many people that here that have a different story to that, you know, and they're going against their every story that they've heard, and all the people, you can hear them, their parents and their uncles and their family members, you know, all these people in their ear. But when they make the decision, it's very uniquely their own, and they go that direction. And what I just think is so fascinating, and I have to applaud you on this, is that you've had that vision from the beginning and you stuck to it. And it sounds like you had a lot of family support to do it. And that is one heck of a blessing. And I think that's amazing. It leads me to now, it's like when you think about, okay, now you're an artist, you've been working and you're making, what things interest you? What are the actually before that, let's talk about influences. Are there any particular artists that you artist or people or things? I know your grandfather was a big influence on you, maybe even music to a degree. What kind of influences do you have? Do you look at other artists and try to kind of look for inspiration, or talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot and a lot of influences.
Let's do the top hits. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll maybe go through, you know, like cycles of artists sometimes. When I was doing my third year majoring at Michaelis, I was struggling to photograph in Cape Town because I'm not from Cape Town. And Cape Town is very different from the rest of South Africa because I'm used to Johannesburg, the other major city in South Africa. But it's so different from Johannesburg and even Gaborone, where I'm from, spatially, and you know the kinds of people that you find there and the architecture and everything around. So I had no connection to Cape Town, so I don't know what to photograph, and I'm not really good at street photography, I would say. And then I discovered an artist called Lebogang Kanye, and what she does is she makes these like huge sets and silhouettes of people, and she dresses up as like her mom or her dad to retell stories of her childhood, or you know, build these familial connections. So then that's when it clicked on me that like, oh wow, like you know, practically I don't have to go out into the real world and just, you know, put things on a 35 millimeters viewfinder, snap that photo, but I can construct the set in the studio and tell a story in that kind of way as well. That's how I can build my images. And then that same year, I discovered the work of Chris O'Feely. He's a British painter, and there was this one specific painting that I found called you know, No Woman, No Cry. And it was a painting of the mother of Stephen Lawrence, who was a black man who was murdered in London in the 90s, I believe, and it was a racially motivated murder. And the mom was on the news a lot at the time for looking for justice for her son. And what Christopher did was he painted the mom, and you can see it like it's like a side profile of her like this, and like you can see the tears running down, and it's like a very like beautiful painting. And even in the tears, like he uses like a collage of like I think his pictures or something. Um, so that activated something in me that like, oh wow, like you can also make work about things that are happening in the public, the news cycle, like things that affect us all. Personal stories about a person, but a universal story of loss and injustice, social commentary. So I would say those were two very pivotal artists in my development in terms of practical, how to resolve something, like how to make art in some kind of way, and then what your art is going to be about. But aside from that, I watch a lot of anime. Anime has always been a big influence in terms of like compositions and colors. Like anime is so rich visually in terms of composition and colors, and just the way the Japanese style of art is just so crazy to me. Music as well, again, like visual to audio is very important to me. Like, yeah, I hear something and then I'm like, how do I make that image? So yeah, those are
That's amazing. There's some people that they say when they hear something they can see color or whatever, and I think that's interesting. That's really interesting. So talk to me about. I know history is really important to you. You pointed to that and a previous project, diving into your own personal history. Is a lot of your work centered around those themes? Talk to me a little bit about that progression, and maybe we can even jump into a project and kind of take a look at one.
Yeah,
what do you think?
Definitely. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I can share the screen now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in 2017, I chose photography and new media as my majors. And then in the following year, I chose my final one, which is photography. And again, like, I was struggling to see how I was going to be a photographer, even though I had the great technical skills of composition and, balancing the light and all these kinds of things. I didn't know how I was going to like, photography is quite literal. Like you go somewhere and you photograph something and it might be staged, but like there's something about it that like is interesting for you as the author, that photographic artwork, being trained as an artist photographer as opposed to like, a reportage or documentary photographer, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, I discovered the work of Lebogang Kanye, who makes these large sets, and then I was like, oh, let me do that. Like, let me start, using miniature sets. Mine are going to be smaller, so that it's much easier to do than building something large that's life-sized. And I've always enjoyed telling personal stories about my childhood, and at the time in 2018, I turned 21 years old. The year before, in December of 2017, and my grandmother used to have this sculpture that she would use in the house because I was living with my grandparents for the first 5 years of my life. And as a kid, I was very mischievous. Like I liked, breaking my grandmother's fine china and bowls and like teapots and everything. I just like going.
You liked breaking it?
I think it was the sensation of hearing the breaking,
the pop.
Like, yeah, the pop, the crackle of like the bang.
I can also hear your grandma's heart breaking. Like I can also hear that too. Like, what are you doing? Oh my gosh. Okay, that's amazing. So you would break. So this image is kind of. I think we would have been friends as kids. Go on.
Yeah. So this is a reconstruction of that story, and this
oh my
basically like what grandma's home looked like, and there you can see my grandfather. There, these are cardboard cutouts, representations. So my grandfather again was blind, so he couldn't see me. He couldn't stop me from doing these things. He would just hear it after the fact because he would kind of wing babysitting me or something while my grandma's in a different part of the house, or she's at work or something, buying groceries.
That's great.
So yeah, it's just a very, my first experience of making a miniature set in this playful story. So my grandmother would have to clean them up, and then she put this guy here. This was the sculpture. Mono Muntu, that's what she used to call it. Mono Muntu just means a man who is black, like literal translation, or a black man. So I would see that and then come back, and I just used to get scared by this thing, apparently, and that's what stopped me from breaking these balls and china and everything. And then fast forward, 2018, my grandmother gave it to me as like a family heirloom when I turned 21. So yeah, that's the story behind that, and that's how I got into visual storytelling and using miniature sets as something in my toolbox, in my arsenal of resolving projects.
So you started constructing images, and you kind of moved into that. How did you build those sets? I know here it was the strangest thing. They actually have a store with miniature things and like furniture. Did you find a store like that, or did you make them?
My lecturer gave me her like childhood toys to use for those couches that you see in there, and then the rest of it is a cardboard box, like it's the normal cardboard box, and then I would use like wrapping paper to do the wallpaper in the background, and then the rest of it is cardboard cutouts. So
Sure.
Just like take my old family photographs, cut them out, paste them on cardboard, and then plant them in different parts of the box.
It's interesting. And even the images, were those family images on the wall in the frames?
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I think that's fascinating. I'm starting to see how you're trying to construct a world, which is, like you said, it's quite different than reportage or anything else. And so you're going to take us to another place, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I did I did Mono Muntu as a 2-week project. It was very quick in my first year of majoring in photography, and after that I knew that I wanted to do something more serious that would touch on more serious topics and maybe outside of myself. And a week or two after I finished Mono Muntu, there was a tragedy that happened back home while I was in Cape Town. And on the 18th of April in 2018, there was an incident that happened where a fighter jet pilot crashed into a nearby golf course bush area in Botswana. And it's Friday when it happened, and everything's going crazy on social media. I'm getting WhatsApp messages, and like everybody's talking about it. I'm like, oh, this is crazy. And the story of it was, as it was being reported in the newspapers, was that this fighter jet pilot, what they were doing was they were rehearsing for the Botswana Defense Force Day celebrations. So the military has these celebrations every year in April, just commemorating the military, basically. And the fighter jet pilots they always have their celebrations where they go up in the sky and they do the loops and the everything like that. So they were rehearsing on the Friday for the next day, the Saturday celebrations. And one of the pilots in a squadron of 3 reported a fault in his plane. And the control tower told him to report a mayday. So, just eject the plane or the aircraft. But then the issue with that is where he was flying over, because it's moving so fast, these aircrafts move so fast. he could predict that if he just ejects the plane and it just crashes somewhere, then it could potentially crash into a nearby, school, a highly populated area. There's the University of Botswana. My old high school was around the area. He was flying over and all these kinds of things. There's a hotel, all these places, residential homes. And he made the decision, this is how it was being reported, he made the decision to purposefully crash the aircraft into a bush area nearby a golf course, saving, potentially like hundreds of lives by doing that, by taking his own life. So it was seen as a sacrifice, and that's how people were reporting it. And that was the first time I had heard the word for hero in Setswana, which is mohaka, because Botswana's a country that's very unique in the African continent in that it experienced a peaceful transition from being a colonial state to an independent nation. There was no bloodshed, there was no war, there was no civil uprising or anything of that nature. It was just negotiations between, local leaders, like tribe leaders, and the British. So we don't have a lot of examples of heroes in our history. So when I heard that, I was like, whoa, like this is the first time I've ever heard a Motswana, another, person from my country being called as a hero. This is the first time we've recognized a hero, in my opinion, in my lifetime at least. So immediately when that happened, I knew I was going to do a project about that, because I thought about the news cycle of, the news is breaking instantly on social media. Everybody's going to the crash site and like taking pictures and taking photos, and different people, ex-military people, are like running through what was probably going through the guy's mind, and these WhatsApp audios are circulating and things like that in groups and whatnot. So I looked at it and I was like, on the Friday, immediately as it happened, and I was like, what's going to happen is Monday, the newspapers are going to come out reporting for everybody what happened. And then the following weekend, they're going to have his funeral and his burial where he lives. And then after that, we'll forget about it probably as a society and as a culture. But then, for me, it was like if he had done the opposite, if he did actually report that Mayday and, the plane, like, for example, the fighter jet crashes into like, a high school or a university, we'd still be talking about it now. Like, because it'll be a memorial site and, be this loss and this tragedy. And we'd probably be looking at that fighter jet pilot like, how could you have done that? Like, there's no excuse for that loss of life kind of sort of thing. So I wanted us to, reflect on this man's life and this perceived sacrifice as we were hearing it at the time. And it was a mystery because, people were questioning, like, what was the cause of it? Was it, was there something wrong with the pilot, or was there something wrong with the machine? And there were, conflicting like reports from the military and how they were reporting it in the news. And then people who are outside the military and other people viewed it and things like that. So all of that was really interesting to me as a subject matter, and thinking about it like social practice. Like, it's important for us to reflect on this moment and think about our mortality, because that was something as a 21-year-old I was thinking about a lot, is my mortality, that like we get in airplanes every day, we get in cars every day as a mode of transport, and it's a normal thing, but we can go any day from something like that. He was an expert pilot, like he'd been flying for many, many years, so yeah, I'll just screen share the project now.
Of course.
PDF that I've got.
I can see the history of storytelling. Yeah, you tell some great stories. You were talking about how you grew up with audible stories being told and stuff, and so you can hear that with you, because you do a really nice job of creating context and all that, and now it's making a lot of sense in your work now. So go through this, and I'll ask questions as we go.
Thank you. So yeah, it's a double-sided book, and it has two titles. The first one is Fly Machine, and the second one is Mohaka, which means hero in Setswana. So on the one side of the book, you page through it, and it's a retelling of the story using miniature sets, and the fighter jet, like as you see it. And as I was hearing the story being told of, like, they were flying in the morning, going through different parts of Gaborone, the city center, the surrounding areas, and it's just a nice, normal, day of a pilot doing his thing, rehearsing. And there's like this inside part of it where it's like a fold out page, and there's this like, oh, like something might have happened to this pilot. And then back to the normal story, and there's this moment of doom. So you see the colors changing from, a yellow, which can be kind of seen as like happy to an extent, to like an orange or a red. And there's this like hand that pulls the plane down. And I was using like a cameo obscura with like a tracing paper as the background to create this kind of like hazy, sort of surreal, dreamlike effect. Because again, like, it's also about memory. The fact that this is a collective thing that like we're all hearing about, and people's interpretations of the story. Because we don't know. That was the whole aspect of the story, is that like only the pilot will ever really know what happened to him. And then the plane experiences a malfunction. Something's wrong. The pilot is losing control of the aircraft. And then it goes into a ball of flames, and there's eventually a crash. And it's this tragic ending of this story being told through a toy fighter jet. And then, the excavation that happens afterwards. And again, using a hand to represent this force of, you might think of it as a god or a deity that like, caused this incident, as maybe a type of explanation of what happened. And then I'm going to go on the other side of it. So it's an interesting viewing experience. So then you would like, if you can see me here, so, I got the book here. So it's like on the one side, then you flip it over like this, and you got the other side of it. And you'd read this one like how you read like a manga from like, left to right, like that. And this is me doing the story from a more documentary reportage aspect. So I had like, a whole semester to do this project. So I went back to Botswana, and, again, thinking about this experience of being on an aircraft. So this is the commercial airline in Botswana, Air Botswana, that we use. Me being in on a plane, going back home, and then going back to the areas where the pilot would have been flying over, and using a different color tone on the other side. Blue is the national color of Botswana, one of the national colors on our flag. Because again, this was someone who was working for the military. This is, the exit sign on a commercial plane, the Air Botswana. So this is where the pilot started experiencing a malfunction. He was flying over the Gaborone Dam, which is the main water supply of the city. And I was also thinking about his family and who lost something. So photographing people, representing people, but he had a daughter that he left behind, his only child. This is actually my sister, but I did want that representation of a young girl to represent, someone who's lost someone. And then you have sort of like this, like, kind of, I guess, breaking of the fourth wall or something existential. The toy plane from the other side of the book is here. So yeah, that's a different panoramic wide angle view of Gaborone, and that's the dam over there. So this is just before he started experiencing a malfunction. A burial site to represent the death that happens, and the end of someone's life. And then in the middle, you get the red and the blue to signify, flip the book over, and the ending of the story.
Yeah. Was it important for you to have the wires in there? Did you want people to feel the crafting of this narrative?
Yes, I definitely
Why?
did that. Use the stage to show that it's not real. I did want there to be an aspect that, this is not a real thing. This is definitely a construction. This is storytelling. Yeah, I think, it's important for it to remain in that way, and it's imaginative, because I also look at it from a point of view of who's my audience, and I want my audience to always remain wide but young. I do think about, like, when I was a kid, I didn't have these kinds of experiences of art. Like, I didn't look at photo books. I enjoy photo books so much now, but I wanted to make a project that, like, a kid could pick up and get some enjoyment out of it. So looking at, like, like the string and, like, how did this person make that? Like, I wanted someone to, like, have these clues of, like, what's the background? Like, how did you make the background? Like, with the kind of, like, weird kind of, like, glossy thing at the back, and then the plane in front of it and stuff like that. So I did want to leave some clues.
The silhouette, you were mentioning the silhouette reference. I see that coming in. I see the prefabricated, like, stages. I thought that was really, really interesting. It's fascinating that you're telling a story. I'm even seeing your anime in there a little bit. Just telling stories through frames, and I think that's it's quite interesting. What do you think about that story? Is it this hero element that is interesting to you? Why do you think that caught your imagination so much? What was it about that story that got you?
Again, it comes back to mortality, thinking of mortality. How quickly life can diminish. And in sort of like an inconspicuous way, I mean, operating an aircraft is dangerous. And in my own life, like, one of my cousins is a pilot now. She flies commercial airplanes. And, I always ask her, like, do you have that fear? And she's like, no, these things are so automated. Like, we hardly do anything. You just press start and then, autopilot and things like that. And also, I mean, yeah, again, like, I wanted this. When I think about making art, especially a project of this nature, I was thinking about back home, and I look at art as conversation starting, like, you enjoy it. There's an entertainment aspect to, especially with photo books, like paging through something and, page to page to page to get to a conclusion, right? Narrative. But I'm also thinking about what are the conversations we're going to have after this, right? Because in Botswana is a very conservative nation, I would say, with very strict cultural practices and norms. And one of them is, death is quite a taboo subject. We don't discuss death a lot. So, when you think about, like, a funeral, a family grieves, but on their own, not openly, and not, like, I would say, even amongst themselves, like, everyone has their own internal grievance, but we don't, like, go to therapy after that and things like that. Things are changing now with the younger generation, like people of my age, who are now in their 20s, and people younger than me. But, I wanted to reflect and ponder on, like, life and death, and what does this moment mean, So I wanted to create something that would, create a conversation, and to reflect on, like, what would we do? Because I'm trying to put you in that position of that pilot. Like, do you sacrifice your own life for the greater good of others? Because that was a decision you had to make very quickly.
I think that is what caught the imagination of everyone. And especially if you have a topic like death that is taboo, and you know what I mean? It's one of those things. Out of all of the options that you had, one of them being death, and dying and sacrificing yourself, and that's the one you choose, that's fascinating, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
It's it's a that's that sacrifice story. It's really, really interesting. So how did you evolve beyond this? Like you've done quite a few projects since this one, and you seem to you lean into your photography a little bit more. You start doing more in-depth photo projects, and so and what I mean by that, instead of constructing a scene, I see more a little different variation of it. You start to evolve. And so talk to me about that evolution. Where did you go next?
So after Fly Machine, which was a university project in my third year, I went into my final year and now so each time I'm getting more time to develop these projects. Monomont was 2 weeks. Fly Machine is about 3 to 4 months a semester. And then I had, nearly a whole year, about 8 months to develop what was going to be my graduate practice. And I mean, I always start with a title, right? A title is crucial to me. And thank you for your compliment about how, my titles encourage people to dig into what I'm about to say or visualize. And I had this title because I was going to make a project about my grandfather and the fact that, he was the person who was a facilitator for me being allowed to even dare to think about being an artist from where I'm from, and, the possibility of it, and encouraged me to do it every step of the way while he was still alive. And I was going to explore this irony or this paradox of my grandfather being blind and wanting a great grandchild who was going to be, or a grandchild who was going to be a musician. But then I'm becoming a photographer. So I'm kind of doing the opposite thing, the opposite of audio, visual. And I was like, you know what, if I'm not going to make a musical album for you, playing instruments or producing audio, then this is the visual album I'm going to make for you in the form of, visuals to tell our story as a family, or the two of us. So, and I borrowed that title from a South African musician called Tumi Molekane. He's mainly a rapper. And his first album was called Music from My Good Eye. So that's why I took the title from, borrowed it from him.
It's a good title.
That's
a great, that just sounds like a great album. Yeah. And it's so fitting for photography.
I would encourage everybody to go and listen to it.
Oh yeah? What's the artist's name?
Tumi Molekane. Or you can search Tumi from the Volume. Tumi from the Volume is the name of his band, and then that'll send you down to all of his discography.
Music from My Good Eye. But now it's taken its form as a photo project with you. That's interesting.
Yeah. So it's this really large book project that evolved from just being about my grandfather or my relationship with my grandfather to also including the story of the family that my grandfather left behind in South Africa and the activism and the politics in the family. So I'm just going to share the full screen now. So it opens... there's an earlier copy with this map of South Africa. And I mean, this is an earlier version, but I'd included lines of the migration that my grandfather had been through and the different points of contact that my family had existed in. So Cape Town, where I went to university, but then you have Robben Island, which would be around here. Which was a prison where Nelson Mandela was kept a prisoner, but also my great-granduncle as a political prisoner for threatening to overthrow the government, as a militant activist. And, my grandfather was born here in South Africa, and then he moved up north to Botswana and started in Francistown, and then later moved to Gaborone, which is around here. So it just gives you an intro into the migration that this family has been through. Yeah. And, back to image making and the different kinds of images that I make. So after Fly Machine, which did include these kind of documentary images alongside the miniature staged images, that's been a continual aspect of my image making, is using different visual styles to communicate an overall story. So I don't look at myself strictly as somebody who does miniature photography or stage photography or portraiture or documenting landscapes and places. But it's all something that's a part of my toolbox to tell an overall story.
So you kind of, oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of use everything. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a challenge putting together this book because there's so much content and material. And it's the story of my family told over 50 years, from 1958 when my grandfather leaves South Africa and then comes to Botswana, and his side, the other side of the family that remained in South Africa, and going through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and then I was born in 1996, and then how my family looks in the present day. So for example, this is disposable film, and this is the train that my grandfather would have used to travel from South Africa to Botswana and different parts of Botswana to here. But then there's a different kind of train that Uncle Zeph was being held on Robben Island, and this is from a documentary film. And this is his son, John Motopeng, and he's also a musician, actually. He's my grandfather's cousin, and he was also a musician. And in this documentary film that's on YouTube, it's filmed by a filmmaker called Kevin Harris. It's my Uncle John traveling from Soweto, which was a township, so one of those townships where Black people were only allowed to live in own houses, and going to Robben Island, where his father was being kept as a prisoner for a visit, but a very special visit because he's got his fiancée here, Ellen, and they're going to ask for permission to get married. And all of these images mean different things. So this is a staged photograph and a reconstruction of a memory from my mom, where in 1985, the South African Defence Force came into Botswana looking for people who are housing ANC exiles, people who are aiding the armed struggle against apartheid. And luckily, they weren't targeting my family specifically. They weren't on the list of people because my family were aiding with the struggle whilst being in Botswana. They were, hosting people who were intellectuals and militants and those kinds of people. But my mom could remember that memory of in the morning when the South African military goes into Botswana looking for these people, the trucks, the army, and you can hear their trucks, and they're coming in and they're causing a noise. And my mom goes into her parents' bedroom and she's like, Dad, what's happening? Are they going to come and find us, or are we in trouble or something? And then, she has this moment of embrace with my grandfather, and, they keeping her safe kind of sort of thing with this impending doom, that's going to happen. And luckily they survived. But, this is my actual uncle, my mom's younger brother, and his daughter, so my cousin, playing the role of my grandfather and my mom. And then this is the burial site where the actual victims were buried in Gaborone of that raid. So yeah, a lot of this project was like that. Also using different kinds of archival material of my family that exists in the public and the private. So some of these are stills. This is more miniature photography. And, with this, for example, I was listening to music that my Uncle John had produced about colonialism and land disposition in South Africa. So all of this comes together, and it's just an experiential kind of book that tells the story of a singular family, the Motopeng family, as they exist in two different countries and the things that they've been through. But it also gives you an inkling into South African history and the history of Botswana and South Africa and apartheid in the, mainly, between the period of the 60s to the 80s, and the things that my family had been through. So this is my grandfather on the right, and this is Zephaniah Motopeng, Uncle Zeph. He was also nicknamed the Lion of Azania. And this is in 1990, after Uncle Zeph was released from Robben Island, and he came to Botswana. And, this is the first time my grandfather and my uncle Zeph had, met after many, many years of him being in prison and him being in Botswana all these years, maybe 30 years between the last time they'd seen each other. And again, it represents these two men who made vastly different decisions for, their individual lives. One decided to leave where he was born and seek a better life elsewhere, and the other remained and, became an activist. And this is my mom, grandmother, and sister, and it was really important for me to just document this, the family in the present day, and the fact that, my sister can have this photograph because, for me, my parents passed away, and my grandfather's passed away when I was quite young. And I'm just going to go through the book quite quickly now, but we're quite at the end. So this is Robben Island, where Uncle Zeph was held captive. So a lot of it is also me retracing the steps of my family and the different places they've lived and existed. Again, color is very important to me in terms of telling a narrative. So, it went from yellows to reds, and now it's ending with a blue again. And then this is the closing image. This photo montage of a tombstone unveiling of not my actual family, but adopted family that my mom has in South Africa. And then me diving into a pool. And then, there's the end papers, picture of Robben Island. And then, that's music from my good eye.
Were you this was a journey of you diving into family history. It's extremely personal. It's related to your memory. And was there anything that you were surprised about through the process of this? Of making this? Anything that you uncovered that you might not have known and it was kind of interesting to you?
The music of my family, because the way I started was music was a key component. It was always a key component of this project. And then it evolved and spoke about, migration and activism, but music was my starting point. So my grandfather didn't get to record music, because he was living in Botswana and there were no recording facilities at the time. And I'd always known about the other musicians in the family, my grandfather's cousin, Uncle John. And when I was going through, the list of things that my grandfather had left, and they're staying in my grandmother's cupboard in her house. And I found the trombone there, my grandfather's trombone. But there was also just a ton of music, like old vinyl records. And then there was one vinyl record where I saw Uncle John on there. And my relationship with him was, I was used to him performing at, funerals and weddings. He performed at my mom's wedding in 1999. So those are my memories of him as a musician player. And weirdly enough, he's also blind, but he was blind from 5 years old. So I have a friend who used to work at a record shop, vinyl records. And, I brought it to him because I didn't have a record player. So I wanted him to transferred from the vinyl and make a mixtape for me so that I could listen to the music that was on these vinyls, because it wasn't on streaming services at the time. Now it is. So the vinyl that I had was the band Marumo. That was one of his bands. But then when my friend started doing the research for me, and he was looking at the liner notes of who my Uncle John was, John Motopeng, he found that he was part of another band called Batsumi. And when he came back to me and he was like, dude, did you know your uncle was part of this band called Batsumi? And Batsumi is like one of the most important jazz bands of that period in the 60s, when they were making music during the Black consciousness era in South Africa. They might have not been famous as other South African musicians like Thero Makepe or Huma Sekela or Abdullah Ibrahim, formerly known as Dollar Brand. These are superstar musicians in the world, and Abdullah Ibrahim is still alive now, and he's still touring and things like that. But they made an important contribution towards culture and history in South Africa. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that about my family. So that was something that I discovered, the importance of my family in South African history, because, there's people that grow up with, uncles that I see at funerals, weddings, and family visits. So I didn't know how important they were.
There's a musical element to that body of work too, right?
Yes. I did do a performance as part of my graduate exhibition for my undergrad, where I was doing these series of portraits, performing as my grandfather, and wearing a suit like he would during the performances. And he was borrowing from the African American jazz traditions of Miles Davis and who's the other one, man? Louis Armstrong, bow ties and ties and things like that. And playing his trombone. So I would just be posing with it, for the stills that I was doing throughout the year in 2019. And then for my grad show, I learned how to play that trombone for about 6 weeks. I had someone at the music school at the University of Cape Town teach me how to play it. And I was just learning how to play one specific piece of music called Young, Gifted and Black, which was originally performed by Nina Simone. So I was learning how to play that composition of the song on the trombone, because it was one of my grandfather's favorite songs. And yeah, that's what I did. And it was interesting because it's a broken instrument. It's from the 80s. So it's so old, and it's you can't really get a good sound out of it, because it's it's lost it's instrumentality, if that's a word. But you can still get a sound, and you can still get an impression of oh, this is what he's trying to play with this thing. And then also, I'm not skilled, but I mean, that was the whole point of the performance, is that regardless of whether I'm a good musician or not, I'm still fulfilling this dying wish of my grandfather, that he wanted someone to become a musician. And I performed it in front of people at this graduate exhibition. So, there's all kinds of people, from lecturers of the university, other students, but then just general public. It's an exhibition that's open to people. So I did fulfill that wish of my grandfather, besides just making a visual album, to actually perform in front of people like my grandfather did.
Wow. I think it's beautiful. I love how it seems like you're kind of starting with the kind of personal projects, but you kind of deviated with the fly machine one a little bit. Yeah, but yeah, I love this kind of evolution, and I see how it's all kind of, your style is starting to take form and going from there. And I love the musical element, and I wish I would have been there to see you play that old trombone, but you gotta be where you are. But I also love old instruments, the antiques. I think they look really, really cool, just in general. Do you have it still? Do you keep it somewhere? Who has that?
Yeah, I still have it.
You have
I've
it?
kept
It's
it
with
in the
you?
family album.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
we all have different things. My brother has my grandfather's walking stick, so
Oh
we
yeah.
keep different things.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
amazing. So you've evolved since school. That was a little bit. What are you up to now? What kind of projects are you diving into now, and what's driving your inspiration today?
So immediately after finishing Music from My Good Eyes, a graduate exhibition project, um, I was encouraged to take it further and develop it more as something that was a student project to create a more professional portfolio and a new photo book because one of the critiques that I got from that project was um, this is great, but like maybe it requires so much contextual knowledge of South African history to understand what's going on here. So you could develop this further and then also just give yourself more time to do something that has so much in it. There's so many different characters. Like there's, your grandfather's story, your great granduncle's story, your mom's story, your story, these kinds of things. So, you know, from 2019 going into 2020, COVID, and up to now, I've been developing a new body of work as an offer for music from my good eye called We Didn't Choose to Be Born Here. And yeah, let me just share the screen for
What a,
this online exhibition. Um, So yeah, this is from an online exhibition from Foam Museum, which is in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and they have a talent program that they do every 2 years now, where they select the 20 best emerging photographers that they see that are representing the future of photography. And they had an exhibition that opened earlier this year in Amsterdam. But then there's an online exhibition that continues afterwards and it just exists permanently. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the project. So you can see this online, foam.org/talent 2024. But if you just Google my name and surname and Foam Museum, you'll get to see it. And it has a description of the project and what it's about. But I'm just gonna speak through it and then just scroll through the online exhibition. So music with music from my good eye, it started with this story about my grandfather that eventually evolved into telling the story of the whole family and things. But I had a heavy focus on comparing within the book, like these two families and aspects of it. But um, one thing that was missing was sort of like my aspect of things, like where do I sit within all of these things, and like where am I in the story? It's something that I always got like throughout university is like where are you in this story or this body of work that you're building, and the title "We Didn't Choose to Be Born Here" looks at me and my personal history and upbringing in Botswana, growing up and going to private schools and being in this like era of globalization and post-colonial democratic society that we live in Botswana, and having access and privilege to go to private schools and the kinds of people I was growing up with all these different backgrounds and things like that in Botswana. And I had a lot of friends who are Americans and Europeans and people from different parts of Asia and Australia and New Zealand. And I had a desire to travel as a kid, and I had an international experience as a young person. Um, so, as a kid growing up, I had, wanted more to be from other places than from where I was from, and this project goes into that, but it also looks at what that phrase means for different other people in my family. So my grandfather didn't choose to be born into apartheid South Africa, so then he moved and uh, came to Botswana, and his uncle didn't choose to be born into an oppressive society either. But he remained. He did the opposite. He remained and decided to become a freedom fighter and joined the Action National Congress and later on the PAC, and then the consequences that has for their children. So my mom grew up in Botswana, and grew up in a very peaceful country, without any wars or internal conflicts or anything like that, but then had a loss of identity. So yeah, this is what the book looks like, and I'm just going to page through it. So those were the things that we didn't choose to be born here from my mom's perspective. And then from Uncle Zeph, his children didn't choose to be the children of a freedom fighter either, because he was in and out of jail a lot, and they received a lot of intelligence from the South African state, and they were ostracized from society to a degree because of their father's politics. So they had a sense of loss as well. So all of that is packed into this book. So, this opening part just goes into my background, how I grew up, using images of my old houses where my father lived and my mom, how I looked back then, archival material, family photos, my mom in the present day. Just my upbringing in Botswana and the different, relationships of my family in Botswana, and that kind of like nostalgia, looking at how my mom used to look, how my sister looks now, religion, which is a strong part of our family, different family members. This is my uncle, comparing how they look in the past and how they look now. And then it ends with this picture of one of my grandfather's homes in Gaborone, where he used to house freedom fighters that were crossing through Botswana on their way to Tanzania for military training to aid with the armed resistance against apartheid. So then part 2 goes into how I first learned about Uncle Zeph through a Google image search of, you just turn your head like this. This is how I learned about Uncle Zeph, was just Googling my mom's maiden surname, Mutopeng. Because no one had told me, and this is just like when we first got ADSL internet in our house in 2008, and I Google him, and I started learning about him. And then, in 2011, there was this television series that was made about the family, called Monna wa Mina, which means man of music. And there you see like a television series about the family, telling some of the stories. There's some of the material from the previous book, the journey that John had to go through to go and see his father in Robben Island. And this is public material that's available. There's a New York Times article describing the kind of torture that Zeph went through as an enemy of the South African state, They used to, electrocute him and, do the kind of like putting a sack over his head and putting his head through water and stuff like that. This was Robben Island. So this is, from, a viewer perspective, me learning in the second part about my great-granduncle and the things he'd been through. And this is his obituary, written by the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania in the Netherlands. People who were supporting the struggle against apartheid in the Netherlands. And then it goes into my mom, who had an interesting relationship with him because at the time that my Uncle Zeph was in prison in Robben Island, my mom was doing her chartered accountancy in Canada. So there's a picture of her in Ontario. And she was just, doing like a project, and she eventually worked in mining. And then this is, a picture of Robben Island, the map. So yeah, comparing and contrasting these two people and these two sides of the family, one that's living a civilian life and then one that's living, a militant freedom fighter resistance life. And then, the different allusions, me alluding with my visual images to violence, and again, using all these different kinds of materials, things that exist in the public and the private realm, pictures of my family with pictures of, newspaper articles. And then in this part 3, this is an interview that my grandfather did in about I think 2008 or 9, explaining his history, where he was born, his decision to come to Botswana, and then why he remained, because my grandfather remained even after 1994 when South Africa became an independent nation. And then this is him in the 60s performing as part of his jazz bands. And this is my grandmother. So again, like, depicting my family in Botswana and their life here. This is from my grandfather's funeral. So you can see a picture of him there. This is him as a young man.
What was it like? What was it like to uncover this kind of information? What was it like? Were you kind of? I'm just curious where your mind went, and
it was challenging because some of these moments are traumatic depending on what it is and which family member it is, because of the things that they went through and the sense of loss that they have. So, there's a quote by Nietzsche where he says, "When you stare into the abyss stares at you." So again, like growing up as a kid, I had, a very like relaxed, calm, peaceful upbringing in Botswana. I was in a protected bubble. And then I started learning all these things about, not just things that my family had been through, but a lot of families in South Africa and Botswana had experienced in terms of forced migration and, oppression by the state. So it's like that darkness, that abyss, I'm seeing it now and I'm consumed by it myself. I had to learn a lot of things that were horrific that had happened to people. But then there's an aspect of healing that comes from it as well, because when I'm making these images of my family and taking these, portraits of my uncle, for example, we have a conversation, and my family's always known what this project is about, why I'm doing it, and where it's going to exist in the future. That, there's a book and images that will be seen by lots and lots of people, and our family story is going to be shared. And they're collaborators. They tell me what they're comfortable doing and posing and not posing in these images, and they contribute towards my image making, not just as like models and participants and actors, but storytellers and authors themselves. This is how I want you to be able to tell the story. But it is challenging, and it was tough, and multiple aspects of it are tough, like learning about things, but then also how do you put all of these different kinds of images together in a cohesive, consistent way? Yeah.
Well, and with the freedom by which you use your toolbox, I think that is the interesting part of it. Is this a completed project, or are we looking at something that's in development?
It's still in development, I would say. At the moment, I'm still looking for a publisher and trying to get funding to be able to produce, a certain number of editions. So yeah, it's in development, but I would say near complete. This is what I'm now showing around to different publishers, and there's been a couple different iterations of it. Like there was one that came before this where it was a lot more like a visual diary, where it was a lot of like text and images and things like that. But yeah, it's quite a long and extensive book, so I'm just gonna end after this last part before we get to the final part 5. Just as like a preview of what's going on. So yeah, I'm just gonna stop it there.
Of course. It's I like your evolution. You're by no means are you done. It seems like you have more to discover and uncover. And when you start diving into personal histories and stuff like that, and you start to realize that you have a figure in your family that or someone in your family that's had that kind of an impact, but I see you like weighing these two personas, the artist and the activist, peace and turmoil, Like you have these two dichotomies that are like bouncing between. Do you feel like you relate to any one over the other? It seems like, you related to your grandfather and the music and the artistry and stuff like that. But do you feel like you relate to Zeph at all? Do you feel like you have a connection to that kind of spirit?
Yes. And it's been one that's developed over time, over the past
Yeah.
8 years now, because so at the end of the book that I just shared now, the We Didn't Choose to Be Born Here, there's an account or an essay or a text that I wrote describing in 2016 when I was at the University of Cape Town in my first year. There was a student movement called Fees Must Fall that was fighting for free decolonized education in all South African universities. So not only does education have to be free, which was one of the promises of the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter was this manifesto that the ANC originally constructed in the 1950s. But it never came to fruition. You still have to pay for public, higher education in South Africa. And then decolonized education. So education that centers African stories, Africanism, and African ways of history and education, right? So this is happening, and it's a student revolution that's happening. And the university shut down. And because I was, firstly, not South African, I was from Botswana. Like, that's where I grown up, even though I have South African family on my mother's side. I looked at myself as a Botswana. And then two, I could afford to be in South Africa and be a student. I didn't, my parents were paying for me. I didn't need any government subsidy or grant or anything like that. And then, at the time, so I had no incentive to participate in these student protests. So I didn't get involved. And I was just like, although I would say I stood in solidarity with student activists, and I understood what they were doing, but I didn't see it as like my fight. And I'd also just never been in a position where I'd even had to think about other people outside of myself in that kind of way, because I just grown up like in a bubble, really, in Botswana, where, I have privilege, social economic privilege, but then just in a country where people don't stand up or fight for anything, really, they kind of like politically docile country to an extent. So in this text, I write about this one moment, this incident that happened where I was on an elevator at the student dorm that I was staying in with a prominent student activist. And, I get into the elevator first, and then he comes in second. And I look at his T-shirt, and he has a picture of my great-granduncle Zephaniah screen printed on his T-shirt. And I'm like, I wanted to say to him immediately, like, hey, that's my grandfather, that's my great-granduncle that you're wearing on your T-shirt. But I knew that if I said that, then he would have been like, dude, that's amazing. Like, tomorrow we're going to march to Parliament, and, we'll give you the megaphone to do a speech about your great-granduncle and how he's inspired the student revolution that we're doing now. We're continuing his fight to achieve the kinds of things that he was trying to achieve. And then, there'll be a night vigil later on, outside the library, and we'll continue talking about these things and, whatnot. But if he had said that to me, then I would have been like, no, I'm not sure. I don't want to get involved quite yet. I'm still trying to figure things out and understand things and whatnot. But I knew if he had, if I had said that, then he would have looked at me like a traitor or like, a sellout for like, how can you not want to get involved in these kinds of things, So I kept quiet, and, we went up to the fourth floor where I think we were both staying, on opposite ends of the dormitories. And we went our separate ways. And I felt an intense sense of guilt afterwards that, how am I not engaging in these things? Like, how are my ancestors, not just him, but other ones, looking at me at that particular moment? And that was like, from that moment, a long process of reflection on where I'm from as a person, in growing up in Botswana, my economic background, my social class, and all these kinds of things, my privilege. And then once I started this project, it was like, you have to look at this thing again. You can't just avoid, these other aspects of society that are outside of your protected bubble. As someone who, can say they're part of the middle class or whatever. And then, as I've been developing this project, I've been reading a lot of Robert Sobukwe, who was the first president of the PAC before Uncle Zeph, Steve Biko, who is another, revolutionary thinker, intellectual of that time period in the 80s of the Black consciousness movement, and reading other authors of revolution, like Frantz Fanon recently that I've started reading as well. So at the present moment, I'm not an activist. I wouldn't say that, but I'm starting to develop more of a revolutionary leftist framework, I would say, definitely, as an individual.
As you learn more about, do you think, I can't help but, think about like Zeph, and he had a very tumultuous life, and I can't stop thinking about that one image of him finally getting out of jail, coming to see your grandfather, and those two guys sitting next to each other, and you can just see in Zeph that he's been through a lot. And if you were sitting there being the person that you are right now, and you told him that story about the elevator and stuff like that, do you think he would look at you and go, this is a tough life, and give you a warning? Or do you think he would, say, what are you doing? You know what I mean? What do you, kind of reading through and diving into that world, diving into that other side? What do you think he would have said to you when you think about that? Do you have a presence of? Do you have that kind of reflection? Do you think he would have been on you, or do you think he would have looked at you and said, "It's a tough life if you go down this route"? What do you think?
That's a very, very tough question.
Yeah.
Well,
considering
these are. I'm not gonna directly answer what I think he would have said, but these are conversations that I do have a lot with my mom, because she knew him very, very well, like as a niece, and so it's also about his background, because he was a school teacher in Soweto, one of the townships in Gauteng. He was teaching at Orlando West High School, and back then, in pre-apartheid colonial times, that was a very prestigious job for a Black person to have. And he was an intellectual. He always had people around his house. There were other teachers and things like that. But he loved music. So he also, like, we were just a musical family, So he's always, he did understand the role of art in terms of revolution, in terms of inspiring people, and the role that media plays in terms of propaganda and getting people to subscribe to a certain ideology, right, and thinking about themselves and whatnot. So, it's difficult to answer.
It is. I know. Yeah, I was just curious if you had thought about it. It seems like, you had said you had some guilt, and so I'm curious if it was maybe this presence of Zeph looking at you like, "Oh, come on, jump in there," or where that came from.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of personal, existential dilemmas that I'm trying to get at in this book.
Yeah.
Because from the screen share that I was doing just now, and where I cut it off in the book, it's there's some screenshots that I put in the book from an interview that Uncle Zeph's wife did. Her name is Ubenia Mutupeng, and she did an interview in 1996 in Paris. And they were asking her about her personal background, where she was born, and her early life, and then how she met Zeph. And at the end of the interview, there's a question where, do you have any regrets about, being the wife of this freedom fighter, and, the kinds of things that you had to go through as a wife. And at the end, she says something which is very important for me right now, as I'm growing as an adult. And she says, I have zero regrets because financially I'm very, very poor. We suffered a lot, and we don't, as people who are far radical, we didn't get any of the fruits of post, struggle society in South Africa. We're not part of the victors, the party that became the ruling party, right? And the spoils of the victory that they get. So financially, I'm poor, but spiritually, I'm very, very rich. If I had to do it all again and marry the same person and go down the path he did with him, I'll do it all over again. So I think that's what I carry forward now is it's better to try and fail doing the right thing, the right morally thing, than to succeed doing the wrong thing. So that's how I feel right now, and that manifests itself in different ways. And as an artist right now, I try to think of myself more as a cultural practitioner. I'm producing culture. I'm contributing to culture right now. So, I think we should all strive to be revolutionaries in one way, because I think we can all agree that we don't exist in a just society. There's a lot of imbalance and hierarchy and hegemony that we exist with right now, and we should all be striving to contribute towards a better global society right now. But we can do it in multiple different ways besides
I would agree.
Participating in a protest. But culture and media products, visuals, are important towards shaping people and directing people towards certain kinds of informations, because my hope as well with media like this is that I contribute towards making is that it leads you to learn about this more radical side of South African history, because everybody's quite familiar with the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela and A Long Walk to Freedom and his side of the story. But there was a far more radical side of the politics of that time,
It's fascinating. You have enlightened me. You have you are on a journey, and I'm excited to see where this goes. You're taking on a subject I think is deeply personal, but it's also extremely relevant to think about and understand. And I think in a lot of ways you are taking a very good approach. I think you're allowing it to unfold for you, and you're being contemplative about it and thoughtful. And I think you should just keep going. I don't think you're done yet. I think you're still discovering things, but you might be. I don't know. You might be really close. I don't know, but I can just hear it in your voice and the way you talk about it and the stories that you're communicating. I think you're onto something, and I think in a time right now when we're extremely polarized, it seems like we have history repeating ourselves, and we have stories like these that you're pulling out. I think they're super important and super relevant. And no matter what side you're on politically, there are really extremes on all of it. And I think as humanity, we're trying to find a central landing place, but yet we need this understanding in order to find it. And so I think you're doing something that's really important, and I want to encourage you to keep going. So I just want to applaud you on that. I just have one final question for you. It's my final one. It's the one I told you about when I first got on this, and I have tons of them. So I know you're relatively young in your career, and you've got so much ahead of you. But I always try to find advice for photographers and makers out there. And if you could tell your younger self something and give yourself advice, having been down the road as far as you are, what would you tell yourself?
Community. Go and find your community. Go and find the people who are aligned with your values. People whose art making, critique, and opinions that you respect, and just keep them close. I think that was something that was very important for me throughout my development, is having people who, art industry and outside, that I communicate with on a daily basis. Because what's really fun for me being an artist in Botswana, like practicing in Botswana, because I could be practicing right now somewhere else. I could just be like having my studio in Cape Town still, or in a different part of Africa, or even in the West. But I'm at home, and a lot of the time I'm explaining to people, like, what am I doing? Like, what do you do these things for? Why are you making these images, right? Like, what's the purpose? What do they serve it for? So a lot of the time I'm giving people their first experience of contemporary art. Contemporary art is, it in terms of exhibiting in museums, producing monographs and galleries and art fairs and festivals and all these kinds of things, right? So I'm getting to shape those experiences for people for the first time. And they inform me, people who aren't in the industry, or people who don't go to galleries or museums a lot, everyday people, common people. Those are the people that fuel my story, just like my family. So community is really important for me, and keeping the community close, because I'm personally not the kind of artist who exists in an isolated way where I'm just in my studio concocting all these great ideas and whatnot. But it's a social practice. And I mean, in the end, like I said, I didn't have a story where I fell in love with photography. But that's one of the things that I enjoy about photography now, is that it forces me to be out in the world, to interact with people. But the way I interact with people isn't just like snapping a photo of somebody. It's like an active, like, we're making this thing together. Like, you're contributing towards this thing. And I'm going to show you every single time that it exists out in the world, in a framed photograph, in a social media post, in a blog post, in a podcast, and all these kinds of things. So, community, find your community and keep them close.
It's all about the community. I love that. That is, it's great. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was really interesting, and I really appreciate you opening up and sharing your story and telling us a little bit about your work. This is a great opportunity to tell us how people can connect with you. You can tell us about your website, and also any social media handles, all of that. Go ahead and tell us how we can connect with you.
Yeah, so people can find me on Instagram at my handle, Thero Makepe, TheroMakepe on Instagram. And then the same thing for my website, so theromakepe.com, simple, very like that. And then you can see my online portfolio. And then I do update it with like the latest things that I'm doing, exhibitions, art fairs, gallery exhibitions, and whatnot. So yeah, that's how people can keep up to date with me.
Once again, thank you so much. Connect everyone out there. Connect with him on his website. Check out. You can dive into there's some other bodies of work that are on there as well. I think we did a pretty good job of covering a lot of it, but I know there's two other projects that I don't think we jumped into, or did we? Or did we cover everything?
No. Yeah, I mean, after we didn't choose to be born here, I've done a couple of like smaller projects that I'm doing in chapters called
I saw it.
Powers That Be. Yeah, Volume 1 and Volume 2. I traveled up north to the Okavango Delta in Botswana, did a residency in Paris for 3 months. So yeah, the way I'm seeing the world now. As an artist,
yeah. It's interesting. So if anybody's interested in his work, go ahead and check out the website. And once again, thank you for coming on. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
And to all those that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. That all helps us with an algorithm. And when you do that, it's a way for you to support us and help us get more content like this in front of other people. And if you feel driven to contribute us in a little deeper way, consider being a part of our Patreon channel. We're going to start building that out and offering extended episodes that might not have made it to the cutting table or been released. We're gonna start putting there, and then we're gonna start adding some other options. So think about becoming a subscriber with us there and supporting shows like this. And as always, we'll see you next time.